Coming up on this week's RegCast.
The challenge for firms now is to decide, are they technology firms? In which case, then they should fight back against the regulation that's coming down. Or are they financial firms? At which point they need to start thinking about how they're going to deal with regulation and being in compliance, which is not an easy task for someone coming from a technical background.
We will have this more regulated and centralized and permission-based DeFi. But I think countries do have the opportunity to really take a step back and really define and think carefully about what is sufficient influence and control, when is a system decentralized.
Really having a true dialogue between policymakers, supervisors and the industry, with one side providing, here's the risks, here's what we've got to try and overcome, how can we do it, and the industry inputting into, hey, we've got all this great technology, here's how we think we can do it, and then meeting in the middle to create really good regulation.
It's perhaps with a little bit longer horizon regarding the further development of CBDC as a public infrastructure that facilitates data sharing. And currently, many central banks are considering launch the central bank digital currency.
The regulators have something to do here. They've got to stop adding requirements. We need to start looking at more effective overall approaches. How are we going to do this in a more effective form of regulated collaboration? And that's different, maybe horses for courses. And then you can start to get to the international level.
Welcome to RegCast.
RegCast. Shining a light on challenges and opportunities for digital compliance.
Welcome back, everybody. Thanks very much for joining the policy session today. I am really pleased to be introducing this panel. The quick background is that TradFi has long been expected to perform AML and CFT miracles, but with limited help from the public sector around the common infrastructure that's required. And that's really not been a very nice picture that for us to look at when we get shown statistics about how effective we are. 99% of economic crime goes undetected today. We've had 5 years of debate about what to do about it, and the criminal networks have only gotten better while essentially the tech has sat on the sidelines. But that might actually change. And I think one of the key pivots that we've got here, as we discussed on the intro, is that we have TradFi and DeFi now looking at how do they think about data sharing and risk quantification. So it's time we start looking ahead to say, what could this look like? And what do we think is going to happen? And to do that, what better than this august set of panelists to give us the finger on the pulse and where are we on the RegTech crossroads? Let me just ask them to introduce themselves first. Brian, please kick off for us.
Hi all, I'm Brian Yeo. I'm the head of the Data Governance and Strategy at the Financial Services Regulatory Authority in Abu Dhabi Global Markets, which is a very long intro. But basically my job is to look at developing the ecosystem in Abu Dhabi by creating appropriate policy frameworks that help foster innovation while mitigating risks. And in this regard, the most recent that we've come up with has been our discussion paper on decentralized finance.
Thank you very much. Nathan.
Hi everyone, great to be here. I'm Nathan. I'm a partner at a company called Extra Consulting. We're a global regulatory consulting company, and we focus pretty much exclusively on crypto asset related matters. And we advise both the public and the private sector. So in the private sector, we work with governments, policymakers, regulators, law enforcement, financial intelligence units, really helping them understand what sort of approaches they want to be taking with respect to crypto. And we do a lot of capacity building and training as well. And on the private sector side, we work with mostly crypto asset businesses, again, helping them understand the regulatory landscape and then also helping them implement regulatory change and apply for licenses and a lot of capacity building as well. So that's me.
Thank you. And it's always good to have a poacher turned gamekeeper on the panel. Malcolm.
Thank you.
Thank you, PJ. Hi, everybody. Malcolm Wright. I'm the Advisory Council Chair at Global Digital Finance, or now GBVC Digital Finance. We are the world's largest industry body for crypto assets, and we do a lot of policy and advocacy work, building standards, working with regulators on various discussions to really advocate what is best for the industry, to promote responsible innovation and all sorts of things like that. I've actually been involved in crypto compliance now, and yes, there is such a thing, for coming on for must be sort of 4 and a bit years. So very since the early days of those regulators really started to look at this field.
Thank you very much. Chusu.
Everyone, I'm Chu Su He from University of Bath. I'm currently a lecturer in finance, and my research interest lies into the fintech, payment and settlement, and financial markets in general. And my most recent paper is regarding the central bank digital currency and international payments. This one has been released and available online.
Thanks very much, Yusu. I think we might have it on the agenda. If we don't, I'll make sure to get it there. And last but certainly not least, NVB.
Hello, I'm Nick Van Benskoten from UK Finance, which is the voice of banking and finance in the UK with over 300 members. I work in the economic crime policy team on a range of issues, including public-private partnerships, including anti-money laundering, anti-bribery and corruption, and we're also working now on crypto. The UK Finance white paper last year was called Navigating the Path for Respectability, where we essentially argued that we all have an interest in making sure that crypto regulation works, and my personal view is that's because the alternative isn't worth thinking about.
Well, thank you all for your introductions. I think the premise I set up in the intro is that we could be at a RegTech crossroads here. Now, that doesn't mean you all have to agree. But Brian, I think, you know, we're seeing lots of fallout in the market right now. At the same time, some policy is being considered, and a number of these standards efforts and debates have been going on for a while. How do you see it?
So I think it differs from section of finance of the financial industry to between different sections. But certainly for DeFi, I think the crossroads are not in 2023, but now. What comes in 2023 and 2024 is the regulation. And if I can put it in another way, the choice for firms now is to see which branch they're going to take of the crossroads. Are they going to go down a path of preparing themselves for regulation, or are they going to continue on straight and go straight into that wall? I think it's a fairly important decision for firms to start making, and it's particularly important for virtual asset firms, because ultimately the culture of a virtual asset firm comes from technology, and it comes from the space and the mindset of a technology firm. This is appropriate. This was appropriate given the size and complexity of the firms in the past, but certainly when you have the amounts of money that were locked in DeFi as of the start of 2022, 250 billion or so, it becomes a little bit more difficult to disclaim liability. So I think the challenge for technology firms now is to decide, digital asset firms now is to decide, are they technology firms? In which case, then they should fight back against the regulation that's coming down. Or are they financial firms? At which point they need to start thinking about how they're going to deal with regulation and being in compliance, which is not an easy task for someone coming from a technical background. So that's the crossroads that they're faced at right now. Even though the rules may only show up in a year or two, the decision point for firms is now.
So your point is it's going to take a while to build that capability in. It just doesn't happen overnight.
That's right. It's not just about complying with rules. It's about understanding why the rules exist and what the purpose of those rules are, rather than just saying, this is a box that I need to tick to carry on with doing my business the way that I've always done, right? And that is the real crossroads. The rules to some extent are details. The decision to comply is not.
But aren't some of these rules just fundamentally incongruent with current business models?
Yes. And to quote the newest Frank Sinatra, there are 8 million stories out there in the naked city. It's a pity half of we all won't make it. And that, I think, is what's going to happen in the space for those that decide to go down the path of status quo. I think there's sufficient scale and size in the DeFi space when you can lose $600 million to North Korea for nuclear financing. That's something that I think people start sitting up and thinking, okay, this has gone from a potentially philosophical concern about what is financial crime to something that's much more existential, something that's much more likely to drive firmer action than has been seen in the past. So that, I think, is the challenge for a lot of these firms. If they can make the culture shift, and more importantly, understand why the culture shift is needed, that, I think, will go a long way towards survival.
Got it. But also there are some fundamental changes to the way business is done that will be required as well. Pseudonymity,
yes,
for example.
So absolutely. I think one of the things that we highlighted in our this DeFi discussion paper is that we believe that anonymity is no longer tenable in the DeFi space for multiple reasons, not just for the AML-CFT reason, which, by the way, we should talk a lot more about the CFT rather than ML, I feel. The terrorist financing, proliferation financing, sanctions busting is a significantly more concerning set than perhaps money laundering might be. But leaving that aside, I think the real challenge in this is going to be working out exactly how to shift this mindset among firms, because it's not easy. It's not easy to tell somebody who their whole life has felt that liability for use of their software is entirely at the discretion of the user, to then be told you should have some accountability for the people who use your software because you have a duty to them. That's not a common practice among the industry, but it should be.
Nathan, I see you nodding a lot. I guess some of this must sound very familiar based on your client base. They're really on a knife edge, making some tough decisions here, right?
They are, and I definitely agree with Brian's points in terms of the. I guess when you look at DeFi in its current form, it's definitely not going to live. We are going to see this shift, and we are at these crossroads where you will see a more permission-based, a more regulated form of DeFi existing, and I agree firms will need to prepare for this and adjust fundamentally the way they're conducting themselves if they do want to fit into this regulated form of DeFi, which I do believe is coming. I would argue, though, that there is probably another crossroads even prior to that, which is the decision that countries need to make in implementing the updated FATF standards. So FATF, a while back, they mandated that basically crypto companies, VASPs, virtual asset service providers, need to be regulated. In their updated guidance that was issued, I think, in October last year, they expanded quite heavily on DeFi. And they came up with this concept of sufficient influence and control. So if you are a party that has sufficient influence and control over a decentralized system, it is likely that you would be considered a VASP and you need to be regulated as a VASP. And that's where all of the AML-CFT rules come in, and there's very little flexibility in how these are applied. So in that case, agree 100%. If you are in this bucket, you will need to fundamentally change the way you're doing business. We will have this more regulated and centralized and permission-based DeFi. But I think countries do have the opportunity to really take a step back and really define and think carefully about what is sufficient influence and control. When is a system decentralized? When is it centralized to the point that you do want to be implementing AML-CFT standards? And that decision hasn't really been made by most, if not all, jurisdictions, because most jurisdictions are still scrambling to regulate centralized platforms, let alone apply rules to decentralized platforms. So depending on how countries interpret this, that could really, I guess, change the landscape for DeFi. You would have some countries that are going to take a very aggressive stance towards influence and control, and almost every DeFi protocol will need to apply the AML CFT rules. There may be other countries that will be more flexible, and there may be certain DeFi protocols that will be able to exist outside regulation. And then another decision which needs to be taken is, could there be another option? Could there be another framework that could be put in place that could mitigate the risks potentially in a different way to the traditional AML CFT framework, which you, again, if you're in, you can't really escape from. So I think there's a big policy decision that's here already that countries need to take when it comes to DeFi.
So in terms of regulatory arbitrage, from a legal regime point of view and what's classified as a which type of asset, that's one thing to think about. But in terms of AML, CFT, do you see arbitrage opportunities as well?
I think there will be in certain jurisdictions. So a DeFi protocol in one jurisdiction will be subject to AML CFT rules, whereas that same DeFi protocol in another jurisdiction might sit outside. So I think there will be regulatory arbitrage in certain circumstances.
And why is that?
I think it's just the way countries will choose to apply these frameworks, and how strict they apply this sufficient influence and control test. I mean, if you take a step back, regulatory arbitrage exists all over the place. So different jurisdictions will apply rules differently. We've seen the UK recently with the travel rule. So they're taking what in my view is quite a pragmatic approach when it comes to the travel rule, and not going to require that every single transaction to an unhosted wallet is verified, and it's going to be done on a risk-based approach, whereas other jurisdictions are taking a harsher view. So, I mean, there will be jurisdictional nuances everywhere, and I think there will be this key decision now when it comes to DeFi regulation.
Got it. Well, I'd like to go to Malcolm here next. Malcolm, you sit in Hong Kong, so you have a fundamentally different perspective, I guess, on than when you used to be based here in the UK a number of years ago when we last met. How do you see the application of these protocols, and is there the kind of commonality required to prevent lots of arbitrage, or are we really in a situation where it's called standards, but it's really not?
So I think when we look at it, and I'll use the example of the FATF guidelines or recommendations that are now being implemented into national legislation, how they are being implemented differently, how there's different licensing regimes. So crypto firms will often work across borders. DeFi is no different. In fact, it's more so going to be across borders. You may have those that control it sitting across different countries, so maybe they're sitting in 3 or 4 different countries. I think you see it more in sort of Asia, perhaps, than elsewhere. The differentiation between different policies. So in Europe, you have the one conglomerate that is the European Union, and okay, there are countries doing slightly different things, but it's fundamentally going to come down to the amendment to the money laundering directive. US will have one policy. When we're into Asia, then you have Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, and so forth, who will all have their own view. So I think we know, if we're going to really move forwards, we need to move towards a world where there's a lot more harmonization to remove that arbitrage between different countries and actually make it easier for firms to comply. So what do I mean by that? I mean, make it easier for firms to register, to license, to passport those licenses and say, well, actually, I'm registered and licensed here. Here's all my policies. Here's all my risk mitigations and everything else. And be able to carry those through without having to put full teams on the ground in every single country and so on and so forth. So in going back to a point, or something that Nathan mentioned around the travel rule, which is kind of like SWIFT for crypto, it's the sending of originator and beneficiary information between 2 parties. There's been a lot of call by the FATF and regulators about the different protocols that facilitate that being able to interoperate. So interoperability of these protocols. I think on the flip side, it would be great to see regulatory interoperability, where actually we can start to see different regulators and different policies actually applied more harmoniously. And that way, for a DeFi provider, it's not, okay, I've got to apply for a license here and here and here, and it's going to break the bank. And actually, all of those that control it could change in 6 months in a really different jurisdiction, and so on and so on. If it's We need to have a new way of thinking about this, because if DeFi is global, if more so than a centralized exchange, then it poses a different way that risk is managed and a different way in which we can license. So by helping firms be able to jump through that hoop to get to a point where they say, actually, I'm thinking about licensing, I'm thinking about all these good practices around AML, KYC, and CTF, and non-proliferation, and so forth. If I'm thinking about those, I've done my risk mapping, I understand the KYC requirements and everything else. And actually, if I know it's going to apply wherever I might be operating, and I can put my foot on the ground so that I'm reporting suspicion, law enforcement know where they're going to come if they're going to knock on the door and say, hey, we need information on that transaction. It's all there. So I think, in a sense, we need to see a baseline, a lot more of that regulation to remove the arbitrage that would exist between, hey, that jurisdiction's light, that one's heavy, I'm going to go there, I'm not going to go there, and so forth.
So it sounds like we need a really strong set of international principles that can align with a heck of a lot of legal framework arbitrage that's been created over the years based on various cultural perspectives of how business is done. So for the purposes of AML CFT, there's a lot of thinking outside the box about how you can create a common international set of practices.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we have a set of international practices with the FATF, but it's just transposed differently by different countries, and perhaps it just needs to be slightly more aligned in a way. I think it was actually Ashley Alder, who's the chair of IOSCO and also the CEO of the Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission a couple of weeks ago, said actually there needs to be global regulation for crypto. And actually I agree with that it makes it far harder to not comply than to comply if you actually have a harmonized framework, even at a base level that you can augment, but have something that is standardized.
That's a great suggestion. Did he suggest who should draft it?
No, I don't know. I don't know. I saw the headline in the exec summary.
maybe that winds up with the OECD or the WTO. Who knows?
Yeah.
Moving swiftly on, Chisu, take us into the wonderful world of international payments, because I think this might help give us a bit of perspective. A much different journey, but yet a lot of activity on it. Are we at a crossroads from your point of view?
Yes, I would like to share some point of view about the international payment, but I would like to start with the objective of financial regulation, which is regarding the regulation of AML CFT. Then there we need to strike a balance between such objective and the promoting competition. And regulators like the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, now takes promoting effective competition as a third objective of financial regulation. And alongside the customer protection and the market integrity and the systematic stability. So clearly there is no doubt to say it is important to counter crime and terrorism. However, if regulators put too much burden to firms regarding identity and the funding sources check, small startups who intend to bring innovative products or services into the financial industry may not be able to afford the cost of AML and CFT and CFT compliance. And this then actually discourages competition and hinders innovation in effectively providing financial services. And the related point is on the effectively implementing the AML and the CFT check in cross-border payments. And this is the point that PJ just mentioned. The business model of the new platform foreign exchange providers may work around such AML and the CFT check. Typically, they combine two legs of domestic payments to allow the payments to reach the international recipient quickly. Say, for example, I am in the UK and I want to pay my friend in Germany. The domestic payment leg, I make payment in British pounds to the foreign exchange provider's local account in the UK. And in the foreign payment leg, the foreign exchange provider uses its euro account in Germany to pay my friend in euro. And in this process, my friend's bank doesn't hold my information at all. And the foreign exchange provider's euro account is taken as the sender. So this actually, such loss of information of the initial sender, i.e. me, is an obstacle for applying AML and the CFT check. Although this is perhaps not the initial intention of those foreign exchange providers, but it does create such consequences.
Nick, can you please give us a thumbnail sketch of your view of the crossroads from the UK's perspective?
But just saying all my best lines have been stolen by the previous speakers, but it's a good debate where we're getting to all the key points have been raised. I think in the UK, the way it's been looked at in terms of regulatory harmonization, in terms of costs, the UK government set out a fairly interesting approach. They have said they want to take a tiered approach to regulation in crypto. And I think obviously central bank digital currency is something that the UK government's looking at. They're now talking about regulated stable coins. So they've got rid of the slightly sarcastic fat F appendage so-called stable coins. I think the UK would like to be a hub for legitimate stable coins. But then that does leave the question about other types of crypto and the broader tokens, and then you get into DeFi. I think the crossroads we've got at the moment is whether or not we're actually going to be able to get past the largely urban myths about the crypto sector being a wild west. We do quite a lot of work with some of the major exchanges, just educating our members on the TradFi side, also trying to identify some common threats, some common interests. And once you get into that, there's a lot of opportunities, but that's not actually the way the regulations are going. The regulations are going at the moment towards a more holistic policy, but still silos in regulation and data. And that's quite painful because you're putting quite a lot of reliance on industry collaboration and industry platforms. And at the moment, that's quite difficult to do. There's also risks about competition and so on if you start to go too far down a kind of walled garden approach. So the good news is the crossroads, I think we've got a lot of good concepts. Do people want to be anonymous? If they want to be anonymous, it's going to be very difficult interacting with a legitimate financial system. And people have to accept that, I think. There's also a crossroads we've heard beforehand in terms of, do people actually want to treat people as customers or as counterparties? Because if you're going to treat people like a financial customer, even if the regulations are slightly different, there is a broader expectation that you're going to collaborate in the case of a hack in terms of a loss. And a lot of the major exchanges and custodians, they're doing that. I've spoken to a couple of people who say their ambition is to displace the incumbents, not to destroy the financial ecosystem, but to get on top of it. Now, that is a perfectly legitimate competitive debate, but it does require you to think about what do customers want. And customers increasingly in the UK, they expect full reimbursement for losses that weren't their fault, regardless of whether it was an unauthorized payment or a scam. So I think those sorts of concepts, we are seeing industry having to take quite a lot of the burden there. I mean, one of the positive things for me is that we do have the beginnings in the UK of a more holistic approach to regulation. We just saw last week, it was mentioned beforehand, the UK's implementation of the travel rule, slightly divergent than the EU direction of travel, but quite pragmatic based on the risk. So it's good to see that coming through. Regulate the risk, not the technology, is a great principle. However, we're also seeing some stuff where I'm less positive. The idea that you would require KYC for transactions with unhosted wallets on a risk-based approach. And we're still working it through, but it looks like that definition has been left to industry. So again, industry is going to have to standardize their approach. The regulations are making some steps there, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. And I'm not sure that industry should be left to deal with it alone. I agree entirely. There needs to be more harmonization. I would always start off about what do law enforcement need? How do we actually disrupt this? But you can't arrest or asset freeze your way out of the problem. So there is going to need to be more harmonization internationally.
Yeah, excellent point. I certainly, we're in the business of collaboration. It's really hard in this space, just given the number of masters that you have to serve, right? You have when you're talking about the the national competent authorities, the national central banks. You're talking about the crime agencies. You're talking about the registries for corporate information, trusts, all that kind of good stuff. Then has to kind of come to the same table, and they really don't want to. You know,
Yeah.
there's been a collective failure of action in this space because no one's telling them they need it. And I guess, you know, the thing I'd like to move on, and maybe we can stick with you, Nick, as we're going into what could be the most exciting. Tell us, in your perspective, at least here from UK PLC point of view, how could we get RegTech to enable a better conversation across all those actors?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I think the UK government is starting to move in a more ambitious direction in terms of that public data. As you said, public data is often the golden key. If you match up public data with private data, particularly if you've done that with a bit of working on the law enforcement and regulatory side, you get much better conversion rates. We all know that. We've had that demonstrated many times, but we seem to do it on an ad hoc approach, or at best with bodies like Gimlet and other public-private partnerships internationally. It's still fairly kind of retail. But if you're going to industrialize that, then you're looking at something really interesting. And I think Cosmic in Singapore, but also the plans that have been proposed for Companies House to become a data matching hub for the public and the private sector, that's quite promising. Now, the devil's always in the detail. I think RegTech could help with execution and risk mitigation. One of the things I've been interested in is seeing, once you start to introduce privacy enhancing technology, and once you start to talk about coding in compliance, then you start to get people focusing back on the regulatory agenda, but more as an enabler. You don't harmonize to take costs away from the private sector, which is often a prejudice. You're actually trying to smooth the working surface so we can do more efficient approaches. And hopefully with public sector bodies like Companies House, but also the National Crime Agency start to get involved, hopefully their voices will start to progress that. And we'll see a little bit more regulatory harmonization and simplification so that we can digitalize it and operate at scale. That's me being madly ambitious, I have to stress, but you can see it's coming now. The one note of caution I would see is that you're right, there's that reflex to make this a private sector problem. Verification of company information does look like it's going to be a government duty in due course, but there's still uncertainties, and we're still pushing for that not to be a knee-jerk responsibility on the private sector to report discrepancies, especially where the discrepancies are based on evaluative criteria. How do you code for evaluative criteria? Suspicious activity reporting has got to have some human element, but it would be nice if we could increasingly get the numbers down to a very much an exception base and avoid this large signal to noise ratio problem we've got at the moment.
Precisely, and I guess that, you know, the verification problem is an instance of what we have for the joint money laundering steering group guidance. That, you know, the couple hundred pages per chapter that everyone refers to today is generally principles based, and you know, to get to any level of detail for RegTech, we got to come down a little bit further. And I know there are the reasons for staying at the principles based, but maybe there's some other sort of user guide or pack that helps instruct those that are trying to use these protocols to get the data that they need. Brian, you've been doing some thinking in this space for a while. What's your perspective?
Before I jump into this, I think the one thing that unifies the discussion between what Nick has just said and Chusu has said in terms of fostering competition is public infrastructure that addresses a market failure. If you have an efficient set of public infrastructure to manage identity through, say, for example, a trusted, reliable digital identity, the challenges of competition are lessened because you can work off of that public infrastructure. But I think the specific thing that I think is the most exciting development is the ability in DeFi to create things that are, to create services, financial services that are compliant by design. Obviously, you cannot get to 100% compliance, because in the DeFi space, you can only have assurance over what exists on the chain. You are ultimately going to be relying on oracles that are able to feed in data from the off-chain world, or as we want to put it, the real world, as you, depending on your point of view. But whatever sits on the chain, once that oracle has given its opinion on it, can be fully compliant. And this unlocks the challenges of transacting across borders. If you can prove who you are, and you can prove that you are where you say you are, then the appropriate regulations that apply to you can be automatically applied in the service without having to deal with the challenges of working on whether you are a qualified investor or not. These things are taken care of by the system. And that is quite transformative, because what it means is that it reduces the cost to firms, it reduces the cost to users for setting up. They know what they can transact with, and they have certainty. I think is the most exciting, what I see as having the most potential for growth, for excitement. Compliant by design financial services are not to be scoffed at, because the cost of compliance is not small.
Amen. Teresa, would you like to come in there on that public infrastructure point?
I actually agree with what Nick just shared. Regarding the public infrastructure, then the one very exciting thing I would say is the central bank digital currency, or CBDC, because many central banks are considering to launch such a government-sponsored coin. And if CBDC proves to be a success, then it will allow those large unbanked population easy access to the digital world. And this will, on the one hand, enlarge the user bases subjected to the technology-powered regulation. So they all will be on board of this AML and the CFT RegTech. And also, there is room, on the other hand, there is a room to promote the CBDC standard data sharing, as most countries, they are in the progress of developing CBDCs. So there is a lot of potential of collaboration and developing data standards and how to facilitate international payment. And this can turn into public infrastructure and a public database. So this will greatly facilitate data sharing schemes. And as I said, once there is a data sharing across different financial institutions, even for those smaller players in the market, this can effectively reduce the barriers and to get into the market and promote competition. So this is very exciting.
Thank you, Nathan. I'd like you to come off mute, please, and give us your comment.
Great. So yeah, I think I feel like Nick a couple of minutes ago, a lot of the words have been taken right out of my mouth by my fellow panelists. But there's quite a few, I think, interesting areas of development when it comes to RegTech. I think the first one, which Brian touched on, is this concept of having like a self-sovereign passportable identity. I think that would be extremely powerful. I think if you just look at our day-to-day lives where we undergo KYC due diligence from a variety of providers, multiple providers are effectively doing the same KYC on individuals. Having that ability to take that somehow and passport that across financial services, I think could be extremely powerful. The use of blockchain NFTs, I think could allow that in some way, shape, or form. It's going to be almost impossible to move to a state where you have your own self-sovereign identity, which I think has been touched on in the past in multiple examples when it comes to looking at use cases of blockchain. I think it's going to be very difficult to have a complete self-sovereign identity, but to be able to take some reliance on due diligence that's been conducted on you and take that somewhere else and use that, so at least to give it some sort of credibility. And entities are going to have to top up their own due diligence, they're going to have to do their own thing, but being able to passport identity could be extremely powerful. And then I think just taking a step back and looking at blockchain technology, looking at the openness and transparency of the blockchain, applying that to DeFi and being able to embed, not only have embedded rules in DeFi platforms, but also have this concept of embedded supervision. There's quite a good paper from the BIS that was released a couple of months ago now, I think, and it's basically allowing regulators to plug into these DeFi protocols, have their own systems in place to monitor and supervise on a real-time basis. If you look at financial services to date, every regulated entity is almost like a black box right now. Regulators usually obtain information on their entities as a result of like supervisory visits. Nothing really happens in real time. It's not until a couple of months later that a regulator will knock on a company's door, inspect them, look for their records, and identify problems. And in the vast majority of cases, by then it's far too late. So having the ability to monitor in real time and plug into these decentralized systems, I think could be extremely powerful. And that's something I'm quite excited about as an ex-regulator as well.
Yeah, quite literally being on the same chain or on the same ledger. Malcolm, I'd like to move, just in order to be able to create some more space for good closing statements. Could we move on to the next question and starting with you, please? Because if there is something that excites you, haven't heard yet, you can also then tell us what the barrier is to it. How would you like to kick this off?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So actually I had two kind of exciting developments. Actually, the first one I was just going to touch on the back of, it's a nice segue from Nathan there. I'm actually working with a client called Nest, who are building we are building a hybrid self-sovereign identity. So that is actually kind of a half-half because in an unregulated world, then you can utilize it fine, but in a regulated world, obviously you need to share the data. Finding that exact point as to how that works is quite interesting to try and work through those challenges. But I think from the barrier would be, if we still look back at the regulation that's been around for some years now, which is you have to provide a physical copy of a passport or an identity, or you have to provide a physical proof of address, are these still relevant with the technology that we have to be able to solve that? Another project I work with, a company called Shift, we're actually looking at government issued digital identity, which again is fantastic when you start to look at it from that perspective, because if it lists on blockchain and you can trace it back to your government, then without your government necessarily knowing which services you've signed up for, then that's again a very interesting concept. The second part just to cover really is around DeFi and DeFi liquidity pools. So another project I work with, a company called Shift, we are looking at compliant DeFi liquidity pools for institutional trading. So what do we mean by that? We've all heard of like Aave Arc, where actually it's like a pot, and all of the assets inside that pot and anything that's inside that pot can be traded. The other alternative is actually to say I take any token and I wrap it with a compliant layer that has been provided by an institution, and then I can trade it on any DeFi platform. So then you have this composability of the asset that you can take from here to there on any platform. It gives you the liquidity, it means you can move it around, but it's traceable back to an institution, which in order to then trade that asset or to issue that asset, you have to go through KYC. So then all of a sudden you've got a KYC traceable asset. Now, the limitations of that are really just around a sort of regulatory approach and how that will be seen, but also just how fast we can get that adopted.
Okay. Thank you. Brian, get your perspective on the barriers in a minute and a half, please.
The single biggest barrier is mindset, and that is the mindset not just of the users of a protocol, but especially the founders of a protocol. It's the mindset of ensuring that, as Nick said, are these my customers or are these my counterparties? If they get, once you have users, once you have founders start thinking about users as customers, the need for compliance, the need for dealing with this follows through. But when your customer is a counterparty and they're expected to have done their research and it's entirely caveat emptor, then why do I need RegTech? Why do I need compliance? Right? Why do I need to take care of them? That's a particularly difficult mindset, I think, for people to come up with. And I suspect the decision on whether users want to be treated as customers or counterparties is soon going to be driven by users, given the ongoing crypto winter. If you continue to treat me as a counterparty when I expect to be treated as a customer, I'm never going to do business with you again. And that's something that firms need to start thinking about very carefully.
Thank you. Great point. And Nathan, let's come to you on your 1 minute barrier, please.
So I think the barrier I'd mention is the current mentality and sentiment, particularly towards crypto and DeFi. I think if you look at some recent events in the market, there were quite a few companies that have gone through stress. We'll probably have a few failures, and it's very likely that the regulatory response from a policy perspective is that of overreaction rather than taking a balanced and proportionate response. So I think this mentality and this sentiment towards crypto could be a significant barrier. And I think the only way to solve that really is through education, taking a step back and really understanding why these companies failed and taking appropriate steps to mitigate those risks, and to some extent, because we're always going to have failure, try and avoid these things happening again, but in a balanced way that isn't overreacting to recent events.
Thank you very much. Very well said. Chusu, why don't you come off mute and tell us what your 1 minute barrier is?
Yeah, as I've said, I find data sharing scheme the most exciting development, and the fragmentation of data and the lack of commonly shared cross-border data standard has prevented efficient data sharing and the compliance check. Because of no data, common data format, and the different language requires a different space in storing a piece of message. Say, for example, in Chinese, certain message takes up only 4 characteristics. When it's translated into English, it may take up 10 characteristics, and the current standards may not allow enough space to store such message. So such message get missing, and sometimes because for Chinese they have 4 towns, and in English there is no town. So the information may not be delivered precisely, and such missing of information, as well as the imprecisely delivered information, is an obstacle. Yes, sorry about it.
Thank you. That's an excellent point about the international nature of the standards we require. Nick, up to you to come up with your barrier and closing statement in 60 seconds, please.
So, I mean, I agree with most of what I've heard before. So I'm just going to say cost is always the killer. We've tried previous utility type approaches, a better way of doing KYC, and it collapsed under its own weight a number of times because of the costs. So I think the regulators have something to do here. They've got to stop adding requirements. We need to start looking at more effective overall approaches. The Wolfsburg Group statement on effectiveness starts off with, first, you need to comply with the mandatory legal requirements. And often that hobbles you straight away. So I would say if you get the regulators to actually start thinking about things, what's their national priorities? How are we going to do this in a more effective form of regulated collaboration? And that's different, maybe horses for courses. And then you can start to get to the international level. And I think internationally, the exciting bit, the new incoming Singaporean president of FATF, one of their priorities for the next 2 years, let's get more international collaboration on cross-border crimes, including cyber-enabled scams and ransomware. And I think DeFi has got a huge role in enabling that.
Thank you very much. Malcolm, your perspective, 30 seconds. What's your one wish for 2024?
More public-private partnership. So really having a true dialogue between policymakers, supervisors, and the industry, with one side providing, here's the risks, here's what we've got to try and overcome, how can we do it? And the industry inputting into, hey, we've got all this great technology, here's how we think we can do it, and then meeting in the middle to create really good regulation.
Thank you. Very well said. Nathan.
So my one wish, and again, this is a wish, so I don't really expect it to happen, but in an ideal world, what I would like to see is that regulation could be more principles based and more building block based, particularly thinking back to DeFi again. Currently with AML/CFT regulation, you're in, you're out. If you're in, you need to comply with everything. Maybe there's ways of splitting regulation into its component parts, especially when you have a distributed model where potentially different regulated activities are being performed by different parties in these distributed systems.
Thank you very much. Chusu.
My wish is perhaps with a little bit longer horizon regarding the further development of CBDC as a public infrastructure that facilitates data sharing. And currently, many central banks are considering launch the central bank digital currency. Bahamas and Cambodia central banks have released their CBDCs, and China is very well advanced in CBDC pilots. And for the Bank of England, they has made its CBDC team independent from their banknotes team. So that's, very good progress.
Thank you. Brian, final statement, 30 seconds, or we're out of time.
Harmonization is bad. Standards are good. Interoperability, what is your baseline needs, is what's important. Not trying to get everybody onto the exact same level of standards, right? Think about what are the minimums. That to me is the upshot. Interoperability, good. Harmonization, bad. Thanks.
Fantastic. So I'll recap that as we have to better understand the exact needs we're getting to across public and private infrastructures with the building blocks in place and a cost structure that matches reality. But to do all that, we need a better approach. And it's really, really easy to talk about collaboration and industry doing lots of stuff. It needs a mandate. I'll leave it at that. Thank you all very, very much. It's been a fantastic panel, and I look forward to being with you in another 10 minutes.
You can download the podcast via Spotify, Apple, and Google. But also, I'd encourage people to come to the JWG website, which, as hopefully you will know, is jwg-it.eu. Go to the Intelligence Hub and create your bespoke library. This is RegCast,
shining a light on challenges and opportunities for digital compliance.